Hello, everyone. How is everyone doing today? Let's turn me around a little bit. All right. Oh, all right. So right now I am saving the trying to see if I can save the image for trying to at least get covers of the books that I'm reading. That way I can at least put it on screen. That way y'all can see. Just at a glance what it is. Okay, go ahead and stick it right there. All right, this is the actual book that I have. I've had it since I was about 14. My parents got it for me as a birthday gift. It contains all 7 books, and I have read this thing so much, and this was before I wisened up to take the extra cover off. So, and it's a hardback. It is a not in exactly good condition. I am not proud to admit that. Um, so I'm going to go ahead and start with the introduction. The stories in this book began as a series of pictures in the author's head. At first, wrote C.S. Lewis, they were not a story, just pictures. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe began with a mental image of a snowy wood with a little goat-footed fawn scurrying along carrying an umbrella and a pile of parcels. This picture, he later recalled, had been in my mind since I was about 16. Then, one day, when I was about 40, I said to myself, let's try to make a story about it. Clive Staples Lewis, or at least he was also known to his friends, Jack, was always an established writer was already an established writer of serious adult books on literature and religion, but as a bachelor who didn't know many children, he had never thought of writing a book for young readers. Then, during the Second World War, when children from London were being evacuated to the country, 4 youngsters were billeted at Jack's home, the Kilns. Surprised to find how few imaginative stories his young guests seemed to know, he decided to write one for them, and scribbled down the opening sentences of a story about 4 children. then named Anne, Martin, Rose, and Peter, who were sent away from London because of the air raids and went to stay with a very old professor who lived by himself in the country. That's why that's all he wrote at the time, but several years later he returned to the story. The children, now named Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, found their way into another world, a land he would eventually call Narnia. As Jack wrote, more pictures came to his mind. One was of a queen on a sledge. The other was of a magnificent lion. He wasn't sure for some time what the story was about, but then, as he later put it, suddenly Aslan came bounding in. I don't know where the lion came from or why he came, but once he was there, he pulled the whole story together. All kinds of things went into the making of Narnia. There was the intriguing question asked him by one of the evacuees, who wanted to know whether there was anything behind the old wardrobe that stood in the kilns. And there were memories of his own childhood, how he and his brother, Horny, used to climb into that very wardrobe made by their grandfather and tell each other stories in the dark. Some of Jack's inspiration came from the books he had loved when he was young, the talking animals in the tales of Beatrix Potter, or in the magical adventures that happened to ordinary children in the stories of E. Nesbit, the wicked queen from Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, the dwarfs of the old German myths, Irish fairy tales, myths and legends, and the mythological creatures from the legends of ancient Greece. But these were just some of the ingredients. What Jack did was mix them, together with elements of his Christian belief, into an entirely new and original recipe. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was published in 1950 with the illustrations by Pauline Baynes, a young artist who perfectly captured, in line, the pictures that Jack Lewis had seen in his head. By that time, Jack had already started writing more stories about how the four children found their way back into Narnia in Prince Caspian, 1951, and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, 1952. Jack experimented with the differences in time between our world and Narnia, a device that meant that there were always something unusual and unexpected about each new story. When I was done, the vo- when I had done the voyage, Jack later recalled, I felt quite sure it would be the last, but I found I was wrong. In 1953, he wrote The Silver Chair, and the following year, The Horse and His Boy, which was set during the time period of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Each book introduced memorable new Narnian characters, such as Reepicheep the mouse, Trumpkin the dwarf, and Puddleglum the marshwiggle, and, from this world, the plucky Jill Pole and the unpleasant Eustace Scrubb, who gets turned into a dragon. In this edition, the stories have been arranged in the chronological order in which C.S. Lewis wanted them to be read. However, that is not the order in which they were written. For example, the sixth book that he wrote turned out to really be the first. Published in 1955, The Magician's Nephew told how the journeying between the two worlds first began, as well as explaining various mysteries, such as how the wardrobe came to be the door into Narnia and why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood. As for the Magnificent Lion, he plays an important role in every story. In The Magician's Nephew, he gives life to Narnia. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he defeats the evil of the White Witch. And in the final volume of what is now known as the Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan concludes the story of Narnia and leads its faithful friends to a new world. C.S. Lewis once said, "People don't write the books I want, so I have to do it for myself." In doing so, he wrote the books that millions of other people also wanted to read. The Chronicles of Narnia have captivated several generations of readers, young and old, and happily show no sign of losing their magical hold over our imaginations. Brian Sibley. So, the first book to be read will be The Magician's Nephew. This is a story about something that happened long ago when your grandfather was a child. It was a very important story because it shows how all the comings and goings between our own world and the land of Narnia first began. In those days, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was still living in Baker Street, and the Bastables were looking for treasure in the Lewisham Road. In those days, if you were a boy, you had to wear a stiff Eton collar every day, and schools were usually nastier than now, but meals were nicer. And as for sweets, I won't tell you how cheap and good they were, because it would only make your mouth water in vain. And in those days there lived a London girl called Polly Plummer. She lived in one of the long rows of houses which were all joined together. One morning she was out in the back garden when a boy scrambled up from the garden next door and put his face over the wall. Polly was very surprised, because up till now there had never been any children in that house, but only Mr. Ketterley and Miss Ketterley, a brother and sister, old bachelor and old maid, lived together. So she looked up, full of curiosity. The face of the strange boy was very grubby. It could hardly have been grubbier if he had first rubbed his hands in the earth, and then had a good cry, and then dried his face with his hands. As a matter of fact, this was nearly what he had been doing. "Hullo," said Polly. "Hullo," said the boy. "What's your name?" "Polly," said Polly. "What's yours?" "Diggory," said the boy. "I say, what a funny name," said Polly. "It isn't half so funny as Polly," said Diggory. "Yes, it is," said Polly. "No, it isn't," said Diggory. "At any rate, I do wash my face," said Polly, "which is what you need to do, especially after—" and then she stopped. She had been going to say, "after you've been blubbering," but she thought that wouldn't be polite. "All right, I have it then," said Diggory in a much louder voice, like a boy who was so miserable that he didn't care who knew he had been crying. "And so would you," he went on, "if you'd lived all your life in the country and had a pony and a river at the bottom of the garden, and then been brought to live in this beastly hole like this." "London isn't a hole," said Polly indignantly, but the boy was too wound up to take any notice of her, and he went on. "And if your father was away in India, and you had to come and live with an aunt and an uncle who's mad, who would like that? And if the reason was that they were looking after your mother, and if your mother was ill and was going to die," and then his face went the wrong sort of shape, as it does when you're trying to keep back your tears. "I didn't know. I'm sorry," said Polly humbly. But then, because she hardly knew what to say, and also to turn Diggory's mind to cheerful subjects, she asked, "Is Mr. Ketterley really mad?" "Well, either he's mad," said Diggory, "or there's some other mystery. He has a study on the top floor, and Aunt Letty says I must never go up there. Well, that looks fishy to begin with. And then there's another thing. Whenever he tries to say anything to me at meal times, he never tries to talk to her. She always shuts him up. She says, 'Don't worry the boy, Andrew,' or 'I'm sure Diggory doesn't want to hear about that,' or else, 'Now, Diggory, wouldn't you like to go out and play in the garden?' What sorts of things does he try to say? I don't know. He never gets far enough. But there's more than that. One night, it was last night in fact, as I was going past the foot of the attic stairs on my way to bed, and I don't much care for going past them either, I'm sure I heard a yell. Perhaps he keeps a mad wife shut up in there. Yes, I've thought of that. Or perhaps he's a Quainer. Or perhaps, or he might have been a pirate, like the man at the beginning of Treasure Island, and be always hiding from his old shipmates." "How exciting!" said Polly. "I never knew your house was so interesting." "You may think it interesting," said Diggory, "but you wouldn't like it if you had to sleep there. But how would you like to lie awake listening for Uncle Andrew's step to come creeping along the passage to your room. And he has such an awful eyes. That was how Polly and Diggory got to know one another. And as it was just beginning of the summer holidays, and neither of them was going to sea that year, they met nearly every day. Their adventures began chiefly because it was one of the wettest and coldest summers there had been for years. That drove them to do indoor things. You might say indoor exploration. It is wonderful how much exploring you can do with a stump of candle in a big house, or in a row of houses. Polly had discovered long ago that if you opened a certain little door in the box room attic of your house, you would find a cistern and a dark place behind it which you could get into by a little careful climbing. The dark place was like a long tunnel with a brick wall on one side and sloping roof on the other. In the roof there was little chunks of light between the slats. There was no floor in this tunnel. You had to step from rafter to rafter, and between them there was only plaster. If you stepped on this, you would find yourself falling through the ceiling of the room below. Polly had used the bit of tunnel just beside the cistern as a smuggler's cave. She had brought up bits of old packing cases and the seats of broken kitchen chairs, and things of that sort, and spread them across from rafter to rafter, so as to make a bit of floor. Here she kept a cash box containing various treasures, and a story she was writing, and usually a few apples. She had often drunk a quiet bottle of ginger beer in there, and old bottles made it look more like a smuggler's cave. Diggory quite liked the cave. She wouldn't let him see the story, but he was more interested in exploring. "Look here," he said. "How long does this tunnel go on for? I mean, does it stop where your house ends?" "No," said Polly. "The walls don't go out to the roof. It goes on. I don't know how far." "Then we should get the length of the whole row of houses." "So we could," said Polly. "And oh, I say." "What?" "We could get into the other houses." "Yes, and get taken up for burglars?" "No, thanks." "Don't be so jolly clever. I was thinking of the house beyond yours." "What about it?" "Why, it's the empty one. Daddy says it's always been empty ever since we came here." "I suppose we ought to have a look at it, then," said Diggory. He was a good deal more excited than you'd have thought from the way he spoke, for of course he was thinking, just as you would have been, of all the reasons why the house might have been empty so long. So was Polly. Neither of them said the word haunted, and both of them felt that one thing had to be one of them, and both felt that once the thing had been suggested, it would be feeble not to do it. "Shall we go and try it now?" said Diggory. "All right," said Polly. "Don't if you'd rather not," said Diggory. "I'm game if you are," she said. "How are we to know when we're in the next house but one?" They decided they would have to go out into the box room and walk across it, taking steps, as long as the steps from one rafter to the next. That would get them an idea of how many rafters went to a room. Then they would allow about 4 more for the passage between the 2 attics in Polly's house, and then the same number for the maid's bedroom as for the box room. That would give them the length of the house. When they had done that distance twice, they would be at the end of Diggory's house. Any door they came to after that would let them into the attic of the empty house. "What do you I don't expect it's really empty at all," said Diggory. "What do you expect?" "I expect someone lives there in secret, only coming in and out at night with a dark lantern. We shall probably discover a gang of desperate criminals and get a reward. It's all rot to say a house would be empty all those years unless there was some mystery." "Daddy thought it must be the drains," said Polly. "Pooh! Grown-ups are always thinking of uninteresting explanations," said Diggory. Now that they were talking in daylight in the attic instead of by candlelight in the smuggler's cave, it seemed much less likely that the empty house would be haunted. When they had measured the attic, they had to get a pencil to do a sum. They both got different answers to it at first, and even when they agreed, I'm not sure they got it right. They were in a hurry to start on the exploration. We mustn't make a sound, said Polly, as they climbed in again behind the cistern. Because it was such an important occasion, they took a candle each. Polly had a good store of these in her cave. It was very dark and dusty and draughty, and they stepped from rafter to rafter without a word, except when they whispered to one another, "We're opposite your attic now," or "This must be halfway through our house." And neither of them stumbled, and the candles didn't go out. And at last they came to where they could see a little door in the brick wall on their right. There was no bolt or handle on this side of it, of course, for the door had been made for getting in, not for getting out. But there was a catch, as often is on the inside of a cupboard door, which they felt sure they would be able to turn. "Shall I?" said Diggory. "I'm game if you are," said Polly, just as she had before. Both felt that it was becoming very serious, but neither would draw back. Diggory pushed round the catch with some difficulty. The door swung open, and the sudden daylight made them blink. Then, with a great shock, they saw that they were looking, not into a deserted attic, but into a furnished room. But it seemed empty enough. It was dead silent. Polly's curiosity got the better of her. She blew out her candle and stepped out into the strange room, making no more noise than a mouse. It was shaped, of course, like an attic, but furnished as a sitting room. Every bit of the walls was lined with shelves, and every bit of the shelves was full of books. A fire was burning in the grate. You remember that it was a very cold, wet summer that year. And in front of the fireplace, its back toward them, was a high-backed armchair. Between the chair and Polly, and filling most of the middle of the room, was a big table piled with all sorts of things: printed books, books of the sort that you write in, and ink bottles and pens and sealing wax and a microscope. But what she noticed first was a bright red wooden tray with a number of rings on it. They were in pairs, a yellow one and a green one together. They were no bigger than ordinary rings, and no one could help but notice them because they were so bright. They were the most beautiful, shiny little things you can imagine. If Polly had been a very little younger, she would have wanted to put one in her mouth. The room was so quiet that you noticed the ticking of the clock at once, and yet, as she now found, it was not absolutely quiet either. There was a very, very faint humming sound. If vacuum cleaners had been invented in those days, Polly would have thought it was the sound of a hoover being worked a long way off, several rooms away and several floors below. But it was a nicer sound than that, a more musical tone, only so faint that you could hardly hear it. "It's all right. There's no one here," said Polly, over her shoulder to Diggory. She was speaking above a whisper now, and Diggory came out, blinking and looking extremely dirty, as indeed Polly was too. "This is no good," he said. "It's not an empty house at all. We'd better leave before anyone comes." "What do you think those are?" said Polly, pointing at the colored rings. "Oh, come on," said Diggory. "The sooner—" He never finished what he was going to say, for at that moment something happened. The high-backed chair in front of the fire moved suddenly, and there rose up out of it, like a pantomime demon coming out of a trap door, the alarming form of Uncle Andrew. They were not in the empty house at all. They were in Diggory's house, and in the forbidden study. Both children said, "Oh," and realized their terrible mistake. They felt they ought to have known all along that they hadn't gone nearly far enough. Uncle Andrew was tall and very thin. He had a long, clean-shaven face, with a sharply pointed nose, and extremely bright eyes, and a great tousled mop of gray hair. Diggory was quite speechless, for Uncle Andrew looked 1,000 times more alarming than he had ever looked before. Polly was not so frightened yet, but she soon was, for the very first thing Uncle Andrew did was walk across to the door of the room, shut it, and turned the key in the lock. Then he turned round, fixed the children with his bright eyes, and smiled, showing all his teeth. "There," he said, "now my fool of a sister can't get at you." It was dreadfully unlike anything a grown-up would be expected to do. Polly's heart came into her mouth, and she and Diggory started backing toward the little door they had come in by. Uncle Andrew was too quick for them. He got behind them and shut that door too, and stood in front of it. Then he rubbed his hand and made his knuckles crack. He had very long, beautifully white fingers. "I am delighted to see you," he said. "Two children are just what I wanted." "Please, Mr. Ketterly," said Polly, "it's nearly my dinner time, and I've got to go home. Will you let us out, please?" "Not just yet," said Uncle Andrew. "This is too good an opportunity to miss. I wanted two children. You see, I'm in the middle of a great experiment. I've tried it on a guinea pig, and it seemed to work. But then a guinea pig can't tell you anything, and you can't explain to it how to come back." "Look here, Uncle Andrew," said Diggory. "It really is dinner time, and they'll be looking for us in a moment. You must let us out." "Must?" said Uncle Andrew. Diggory and Polly glanced at one another. They dared not say anything, but the glances meant, "Isn't this dreadful?" and "We must humor him." "If you let us go for our dinner now," said Polly, "we could come back after dinner." "Ah, but how do I know that you would?" said Uncle Andrew, with a cunning smile. Then he seemed to change his mind. "Well, well," he said, "if you really must go, I suppose you must. But I can't expect two youngsters like you to find it much fun talking to an old buffer like me." He sighed and went on, "You've no idea how lonely I am." "No matter. Go to your dinner. I must give you a present before you go. It's not every day that I see a little girl in my dingy old study, especially, if I may say so, such a very attractive young lady as yourself." Polly began to think he might not really be mad after all. "Wouldn't you like a ring, my dear?" said Uncle Andrew to Polly. "Do you mean one of those yellow or green ones?" said Polly. "How lovely!" "Not a green one," said Uncle Andrew. "I'm afraid I can't give the green ones away. But I'd be delighted to give you any of the yellow ones, my love. Come and try one on." Polly had now quite gotten over her fright, and felt sure that the old gentleman was not mad, and there was certainly something strangely attractive about those bright rings. She moved over to the tray. "Why, I declare," she said, "that humming noise is getting louder here. It's almost as if the rings were making it." "What a funny face, my dear," said Uncle Andrew with a laugh. It sounded like a very natural laugh, but Diggory had seen an eager, almost greedy look in his face. "Polly, don't be a fool," he shouted. "Don't touch them." It was too late. Exactly as he spoke, Polly's hand went out to touch one of the rings, and immediately, without a flash, or a noise, or a warning of any sort, there was no Polly. Diggory and his uncle were alone in the room. It was so sudden, and so horribly unlike anything that had ever happened to Diggory, even in a nightmare, that he let out a scream. Instantly Uncle Andrew's hand was over his mouth. "None of that," he hissed in Diggory's ear. "If you start making a noise, your mother will hear it, and you know what a fright might do to her." As Diggory said afterward, the horrible meanness of getting at a chap in that way almost made him sick. But of course he didn't scream again. "That's better," said Uncle Andrew. "Perhaps you couldn't help it. It is a shock when you first see someone vanish. Why, it gave even me a turn when the guinea pig did it the other night." "Was that when you yelled?" asked Diggory. "Oh, you heard that, did you? I hope you haven't been spying on me." "No, I haven't," said Diggory indignantly. "But what happened to Polly?" "Congratulate me, my dear boy," said Uncle Andrew, rubbing his hands. "My experiment has succeeded. The little girl's gone, vanished, right out of the world." "What have you done to her?" "Sent her to, well, to another place." "What do you mean?" asked Diggory. Uncle Andrew sat down and said, "Well, I'll tell you all about it. Have you ever heard of old Mrs. Lafitte?" "Wasn't she a great aunt or something?" said Diggory. Not exactly, said Uncle Andrew. She was my godmother. That's her, there, on the wall. Diggory looked and saw a faded photograph which shows the face of an old woman in a bonnet, and he could now remember that he had once seen a photo of the same face in an old drawer at home in the country. He had asked his mother who it was, and Mother had not seemed to want to talk about the subject much. It was not at all a nice face, Diggory thought, though of course with those early photographs one could never really tell. Was there, wasn't there something wrong about her, Uncle Andrew? He asked. Well, said Uncle Andrew with a chuckle, it depends on what you call wrong. People are so narrow-minded. She certainly got quite queer in later life, did very unwise things. That was why they shut her up. In an asylum, do you mean? Oh, no, 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 said Uncle Andrew, in a shocked voice. Nothing of that sort. Only in prison. I say, said Diggory, what had she done? Ah, poor woman, said Uncle Andrew. She had been very unwise. There were a good many different things. We needn't go into all that. She was always very kind to me. But look here, what has all this got to do with Polly? I do wish you'd— All in good time, my boy, said Uncle Andrew. They let old Mrs. Le Fay out before she died, and I was one of the very few people whom she would allow to see her in her last illness. She had got to dislike ordinary, ignorant people, you understand. I do myself. But she and I were interested in the same sort of things. It was only a few days before her death that she told me to go to an old bureau in her house and open a secret drawer and bring her a tiny little box that I would find there. The moment I picked up the box, I could tell by the pricking in my fingers that it held some great secret in my hands. She gave it to me and made me promise that as soon as she was dead I would burn it, unopened, with certain ceremonies. That promise I did not keep. Well then, it was jolly rotten of you, said Diggory. Rotten? Said Uncle Andrew, with a puzzled look. Oh, I see. You mean that little boys ought to keep their promises. Very true. Most right and proper, I'm sure, and I'm very glad you have been taught to do so. But of course you must understand that rules of that sort, however excellent they may be for little boys, and servants, and women, and even for people in general, can't possibly be expected to apply to profound students and great thinkers and sages. No, Diggory, men like me, who possess hidden wisdom, are freed of common rules, just as we are cut off from common pleasures. Ours, my boy, is a high and lonely destiny. As he said this, he sighed, and looked so grave and noble and mysterious that for a second Diggory really thought he was saying something rather fine. But then he remembered the ugly look he had seen on his uncle's face the moment before Polly had vanished, and all at once he saw through Uncle Andrew's grand words. All it means, he said to himself, is that he thinks he can do anything he likes and get what he wants. Of course, said Uncle Andrew, I didn't dare to open the box for a long time, for I knew it might contain something highly dangerous. For my godmother was a very remarkable woman. The truth is, she was the one of the last mortals in this country who had fairy blood in her. She said there had been two others in her time. One was a duchess, and the other was a chairwoman. In fact, Diggory, you are now talking to the last man, possibly, who had a real fairy godmother. There, that'll be something for you to remember when you're an old man yourself. Bet she was a bad fairy, thought Diggory, and added out loud, but what about Polly? How you do harp on that, said Uncle Andrew, as if that was what mattered. My first task was of course to study the box itself. It was very ancient, and I knew enough even then to know that it wasn't Greek, or old Egyptian, or Babylonian, or Hittite, or Chinese. It was older than any of those nations. Ah, that was a great day when I at last found out the truth. The box was Atlantean. It came from the lost island of Atlantis. That meant it was centuries older than any of the Stone Age things they dig up in Europe. And it wasn't a rough, crude thing like them either. For in a very dawn of time, Atlantis was already a great city with palaces and temples and learned men. He paused for a moment, as if he expected Diggory to say something. But Diggory was disliking his uncle more every minute, so he said nothing. Meanwhile, he continued, I was learning a good deal in other ways. It wouldn't be proper to explain them to a child, about magic in general. That meant that I came to have a fair idea what sort of things might be in the box. The various tests, I narrowed down the possibilities. I had to get to know well, some devilish queer people and go through some very disagreeable experiences. That was what turned my head gray. One doesn't become a magician for nothing. My health broke down in the end, but I got better. And at last, I actually knew. Although there was not really the least chance of anyone overhearing them, and he leaned forward and almost whispered as he said, the Atlantean box contained something that had been brought from another world when our world was only just beginning. What? Asked Diggory, who was now interested in spite of himself. Only dust, said Uncle Andrew. Fine, dry dust. Nothing much to look at. Nothing much to show for a lifetime of toil, you might say. Ah, but when I looked at that dust, I took jolly good care not to touch it, and thought that every grain had once been in another world. I don't mean another planet, you know. They're part of our world, and you could get to them if you went far enough. But really, another world, er, another nature, another universe, somewhere you would never reach even if you traveled through the space of this universe forever and ever, a world that could be reached by magic itself. Well, here Uncle Andrew rubbed his hands till his knuckles cracked like fireworks. I knew, he went on, that if only you could get it into the right form, the dust would draw you back to the place it had come from. But the difficulty was to get it into the right form. My early experiments were all failures. I tried them on guinea pigs. Some of them only died. Some exploded like little bombs. That was a jolly cruel thing to do, said Diggory, who had once had a guinea pig of his own. How you keep getting off the point, said Uncle Andrew. That's what the creatures were for. I bought them myself. Let me see, where was I? Ah, yes. At last I succeeded in making the rings, the yellow rings. But now a new difficulty arose. I was pretty sure now that a yellow ring would send any creature that touched it into the other place. But what would be the good of that if I couldn't get them back to tell me what they had found there? And what about them? Said Diggory. A nice mess they'd be in if they couldn't get back. You will keep on looking at everything from the wrong point of view, said Uncle Andrew with a look of impatience. Can't you understand that the thing is a great experiment? The whole point of sending anyone into the other place is that I want to find out what it's like. Well, why didn't you go yourself then? Diggory had hardly ever seen anyone look so surprised and offended as his uncle did at that simple question. Me? Me, he exclaimed. The boy must be mad. A man at my time of life, and in my state of health, to risk the shock and the dangers of being flung suddenly into a different universe? I never heard anything so preposterous in my life. Do you realize what you're saying? Think what another world means. You might meet anything. Anything. And I suppose you've sent Polly into it, then, said Diggory. His cheeks were flaming with anger now. And all I can say, he added, even if you are my uncle, is that you've behaved like a coward, sending a girl to a place you're afraid to go yourself. Silence, sir, said Uncle Andrew, bringing his hand down on the table. I will not be talked to like that by a little dirty schoolboy. You don't understand. I am the great scholar, the magician, the adept, who is doing the experiment. Of course I need subjects to do it on. Bless my soul, you'll be telling me next that I ought to have asked the guinea pigs permission before I used them. No great wisdom can be reached without sacrifice, but the idea of my going myself is ridiculous. It's like asking a general to fight as a common soldier. Suppose I got killed. What would become of my life's work? Oh, do stop jawing, said Diggory. Are you going to bring Polly back? I was going to tell you, when you so rudely interrupted me, said Uncle Andrew, that I did at last find a way of doing the return journey. The green rings draw you back. But Polly hasn't gotten a green ring. No, said Uncle Andrew, with a cruel smile. Then she can't get back, shouted Diggory, and it's exactly the same as if you'd murdered her. She can get back, said Uncle Andrew, if someone else will go after her, wearing a yellow ring himself, and taking 2 green rings, one to bring him back, and one to bring her back. And now of course Diggory saw the trap in which he was caught, and he stared at Uncle Andrew, saying nothing, but his mouth wide open. His cheeks had gone very pale. I hope, said Uncle Andrew, presently, in a very high and mighty voice, just as if he were a perfect uncle who had given one a handsome tip and some good advice. I hope, Diggory, you are not given to showing the white feather. I should be very sorry to think that anyone in our family had not enough honor and chivalry to go to the aid of, er, a lady in distress. Oh, shut up, said Diggory. If you had any honor and all that, you'd be going yourself. But I know you won't. All right. I see I've got to go, but you are a beast. I suppose you planned the whole thing, so that she'd go without knowing it, and then I'd have to go after her. Of course, said Uncle Andrew, with his hateful smile. Very well, I'll go. But there's one thing I jolly well mean to say first. I didn't believe in magic till today. Now I see it's real. Well, if it is, I suppose all old fairy tales are more or less true, and you're simply a wicked, cruel magician like the ones in the stories. Well, I've never read a story in which people of that sort aren't paid out in the end, and I bet you will be. And serve you right. Of all the things Diggory had said, this was the first that really went home. Uncle Andrew started, and there came over his face a look of such horror that, beast though he was, you could almost feel sorry for him. But at the last second he smothered it all away and said, with a rather forced laugh, well, well, I suppose that is a natural thing for a child to think, brought up among women, as you have been. Old wives' tales, eh? I don't think you need to worry about my danger, Diggory. Wouldn't it be better to worry about the danger of your little friend? She's been gone some time. If there are any dangers over there, well, it would be a pity to arrive a moment too late. A lot you care, said Diggory fiercely. But I'm sick of this jaw. What have I got to do? You really must learn to control your temper of yours, my boy, said Uncle Andrew coolly. Otherwise you'll grow up to be just like your Aunt Letty. Now, attend to me. He got up, put on a pair of gloves, and walked over to the tray that contained the rings. They only work, he said, if they're actually touching your skin. Wearing gloves, I can pick them up, like this, and nothing happens. If you carried one in your pocket, nothing would happen. But of course, you'd have to be careful not to put your hand in your pocket and touch it by accident. The moment you touch a yellow ring, you vanish out of this world. When you are in the other place, I expect, of course, this hasn't been tested yet, but I expect that the moment you touch a green ring, you vanish out of that world and, I expect, reappear in this. Now, I take these 2 greens and drop them into your right-hand pocket. Remember very carefully which pocket the greens are in. G for green, R for right. GR, you see, which are the first 2 letters of green. One for you, and one for the little girl. And now you pick up a yellow one for yourself. I should put it on your finger, if I were you. There'll be less chance of dropping it. Diggory had almost picked up the yellow ring when he suddenly checked himself. Look here, he said. What about Mother? Suppose she asks where I am. The sooner you go, the sooner you'll be back, said Uncle Andrew cheerfully. But you don't really know whether I can get back. Uncle Andrew shrugged his shoulders, walked across to the door, unlocked it, threw it open, and said, "Oh, very well then, just as you please. Go down and have your dinner. Leave the little girl to be eaten by wild animals, or drowned or starved in the other world, or lost there for good, if that's what you prefer. It's all one to me. Perhaps before tea time you'd better drop in on Mrs. Plummer and explain that she'll never see her daughter again because you were afraid to put on a ring." "By gum," said Diggory, "don't I wish I was big enough to punch you in your head." Then he buttoned up his coat, took a deep breath, and picked up the ring. And he thought then, as he always thought afterward too, that he could not decently have done anything else. Uncle Andrew and his study vanished instantly. Then, for a moment, everything became muddled. The next thing Diggory knew was that there was a soft green light coming down on him from above, and darkness below. He didn't seem to be standing on anything, or sitting, or lying. Nothing appeared to be touching him. "I believe I'm in water," said Diggory, "or under water." This frightened him for a second, but almost at once he could feel that he was rushing upward. Then his head suddenly came out into the air, and he found himself scrambling ashore, out on the smooth, grassy ground at the edge of a pool. As he rose to his feet, he noticed he was neither dripping nor panting for breath, as anyone would expect after being under water. His clothes were perfectly dry. He was standing by the edge of a small pool, not more than 10 feet from the side to side, in a wood. The trees grew close together, and were so leafy that he could get no glimpse of the sky. All the light was green light, and came through the leaves. But there must have been a very strong sun overhead, for this green daylight was bright and warm. It was the quietest wood you could possibly imagine. There were no birds, no insects, no animals, and no wind. You could almost feel the trees growing. The pool he had just got out of was not the only pool. There were dozens of others, a pool every few yards, as far as his eyes could reach. You could almost feel the trees drinking the water up with their roots. This wood was very much alive. When he tried to describe it afterward, Diggory always said it was a rich place, as rich as plum cake. The strangest thing was that, almost before he had looked about him, Diggory had half forgotten how he had come there. At any rate, he was certainly not thinking about Polly, or Uncle Andrew, or even his mother. He was not in the least frightened, or excited, or curious. If anyone had asked him, "Where did you come from?" he probably would have said, "Was always here." That was what it felt like, as if one had always been in that place and never been bored, although nothing had ever happened. As he said long afterward, "It's not the sort of place where things happen. The trees go on growing. That's all." After Diggory had looked at the wood for a long time, he noticed that there was a girl lying on her back at the foot of a tree a few yards away. Her eyes were nearly shut, but not quite, as if she were just been quietly sleeping and waking. So he looked at her for a long time and said nothing. And at the last she opened her eyes and looked at him for a long time, and she also said nothing. Then she spoke in a dreamy, contented sort of voice. "I think I've seen you before," she said. "I rather think so too," said Diggory. "Have you been here long?" "Oh, always," said the girl. "At least, I don't know. A very long time." "So have I," said Diggory. "No, you haven't," said she. "I've just seen you come up from out of the pool." "Yes, I suppose I did," said Diggory, with a puzzled air. "I'd forgotten." Then, for quite a long time, neither said any more. "Look here," said the girl presently. "I wonder, did we ever really meet before? I had a sort of idea, a sort of picture in my head, of a boy and a girl like us, living somewhere quite different, and doing all sorts of things. Perhaps it was only a dream. I've had that same dream, I think, said Diggory, about a boy and a girl living next door, and something about crawling among rafters. I remember the girl had a dirty face. Aren't you getting it mixed? In my dream, it was the boy who had the dirty face. I can't remember the boy's face, said Diggory, and then he added, Hullo, what's that? Why, it's a guinea pig, said the girl. And it was, a fat guinea pig nosing about in the grass. But round the middle of the guinea pig there ran a tape, and, tied on it by a piece of tape, was a bright yellow ring. Look, look, cried Diggory, the ring, and look, you've got one on your finger, and so have I. The girls sat up, really interested, at last. They stared very hard at one another, trying to remember, and then, at exactly the same moment, she shouted out, Mr. Cutterly, and he shouted out, Uncle Andrew, and they knew who they were and began to remember the whole story. After a few minutes of hard talking, they had got it straight. Diggory explained how beastly Uncle Andrew had been. What do we do now? Said Polly. Take the guinea pig and go home? There's no hurry, said Diggory, with a huge yawn. I think there is, said Polly. This place is too quiet. It's so dreamy. You're almost asleep. If we once give in to it, we shall just lie down and drowse forever and ever. It's very nice here, said Diggory. Yes, it is, said Polly, but we've got to get back. She stood up and began to go cautiously toward the guinea pig. But then she changed her mind. You might as well leave the guinea pig, she said. It's perfectly happy here, and your uncle will only do something horrid to it if we take it home. I bet he would, answered Diggory. Look at the way he's treating us. By the by, how do we get home? Go back into the pool, I expect. They came and stood together at the edge, looking down into the smooth water. It was full of the reflection of the green, leafy branches. They made it look very deep. We haven't any bathing things, said Polly. We shan't need them, silly, said Diggory. We're going in with our clothes on. Don't you remember it didn't get wet on the way up? Can you swim? A bit. Can you? Well, not much. I don't think we shall need to swim, said Diggory. We want to go down, don't we? Neither of them very much liked the idea of jumping into that pool, but neither of them said so to the other. They took hands and said, 1, 2, 3, go, and jumped. There was a great splash, of course. They closed their eyes, but when they opened them again they found they were still standing, hand in hand, in that green wood, and hardly up to their ankles in water. The pool was apparently only a couple of inches deep. They splashed back onto the dry ground. What on earth's gone wrong? Said Polly, in a frightened voice, but not quite so frightened as you might expect, because it is hard to feel really frightened in that wood. The place is too peaceful. Oh, I know, said Diggory. Of course it won't work. We're still wearing our yellow rings. They're for the outward journey, you know. The green ones take you home. We must change rings. Have you got pockets? Good. Put your yellow ring in your left. I've got 2 greens. Here's one for you. They put on their green rings and came back to the pool. But before they tried to jump, Diggory gave another, "Oh." What's the matter? Said Polly. I've just had a really wonderful idea, said Diggory. What are all the other pools? How do you mean? Why, if we can get back to our own world by jumping into this pool, mustn't we get somewhere else by jumping into one of the others? Supposing there was a world at the bottom of every pool, but I thought we were already in your Uncle Andrew's other world, or other place, or whatever he called it, do you say? Oh, bother Uncle Andrew, interrupted Diggory. I don't believe he knows anything about it. He never had the pluck to come here himself. He only talked to one other world, but suppose there were dozens. Oh, excuse me. Father, Uncle Andrew interrupted. I don't believe he knows anything about it. He never had the pluck to come here himself. He only talked of one other world. But suppose there were dozens. You mean this wood might be only one of them? No, I don't believe this wood is a world at all. I think it's just a sort of in-between place. Polly looked puzzled. Don't you see? Said Diggory. No, do listen. Think of our tunnel under the slats at home. It isn't a room in any of the houses. In a way, it isn't really part of any of the houses. But once you're in the tunnel, you can go along it and come out into any of the houses in the row. Mightn't this wood be the same? A place that isn't in any of the worlds, but once you've found that place, you can get into any of them? Well, even if you can, began Polly, but Diggory went on as if he hadn't heard her. And of course, that explains everything, he said. That's why it's so quiet and sleepy here. Nothing ever happens here, like at home. It's in the houses that people talk and do things, and have meals. Nothing goes on in the in-between places, behind the walls and above the ceilings and under the floor, or in our own tunnel. But when you come out of the tunnel, you may find yourself in any house. I think we can get out of this place into jolly well anywhere. We don't need to jump back into the same pool we came up by, or not just yet. And the wood between worlds, said Polly dreamily. It sounds rather nice. Come on, said Diggory. Which pool shall we try? Look here, said Polly. I'm not going to try any new pool till we've made sure that we can get back to the old one. We're not even sure if it'll work yet. Yes, said Diggory, and get caught by Uncle Andrew and have our rings taken away before we've had any fun? No thanks. Couldn't we just go part way down into our own pool, Polly said, just to see if it works? Then if it does, we'll change rings and come up again before we're really back in Mr. Ketterly's study. Can we go part of the way down? Well, it took time coming up. I suppose it will take a little more time going back. Diggory made rather a fuss about agreeing to this, but he had to in the end because Polly absolutely refused to do any exploring in new worlds until she had made sure about getting back to the old one. She was quite as brave as he about new dangers, wasps for instance, but she was not so interested in finding out things nobody had ever heard of before, for Diggory was the sort of person who wants to know everything, and when he grew up and became a famous professor, Kirk, who comes into other books. After a good deal of arguing, they agreed to put on their green rings. Green for safety, said Diggory, so you can't help remembering which is which, and hold hands and jump. But as soon as they seemed to be getting back into Uncle Andrew's study, or even to their world, Polly was to shout change, and they would slip off their greens and put back on their yellows. Diggory wanted to be the one who shouted change, but Polly wouldn't agree. They put on the green rings, took hands, and once more shouted, 1, 2, 3, go. This time it worked. It was very hard to tell you what it felt like, for everything happened so quickly. At first there were bright lights moving about in a black sky. Diggory always thinks these were stars, and even swears that he saw Jupiter quite close, close enough to see its moon. But almost at once there were rows and rows of roofs and chimney pots about them, and they could see St. Paul's and knew they were looking at London. But you could see through the walls of all the houses. Then they could see Uncle Andrew, very vague and shadowy, but getting clearer and more solid looking all the time, just as if he were coming into focus. But before he became quite real, Polly shouted, "Change!" And they did change, and our world faded away like a dream. And the green light above grew stronger and stronger, till their heads came out of the pool, and they scrambled ashore. And there was all the wood about them, as green and bright and still as ever. The whole thing had taken less than a minute. "There," said Diggory. "That's all right. Now for the adventure. Any pool will do. Come on, let's try that one." "Stop," said Polly. "Aren't we going to mark this pool?" They stared at each other and turned quite white as they realized the dreadful thing that Diggory had just been going to do. For there were any number of pools in the wood, and the pools were all alike, and the trees were all alike, so that if they had once left behind the pool that led to our own world, without making some sort of landmark, the chances would have been 100 to 1 against their ever finding it again. Diggory's hand was shaking as he opened his penknife and cut out a long strip of tuff on the bank of the pool. The soil, which smelled nice, was a rich reddish brown and showed up well against the green. "It's a good thing one of us has some sense," said Polly. "Well, don't keep on gassing about it," said Diggory. "Come on. I want to see what's on the other in one of the other pools." And Polly gave him a pretty sharp answer, and he said something even nastier in reply. The quarrel lasted for several minutes, but it would be dull to write it all down. Let us skip on to the moment at which they stood with beating hearts and rather scared faces on the edge of the unknown pool with their yellow rings on, and held hands and once more said, "1, 2, 3, go." Splash! Once again it hadn't worked. This pool, too, appeared to be only a puddle. Instead of reaching a new world, they only got their feet wet and splashed their legs for a second time that morning. If it was morning, it seems to always be the same time in the wood between worlds. "Blast and botheration!" exclaimed Diggory. "What's gone wrong now? We put on our yellow rings all right. He said yellow for the outward journey." Now the truth was that Uncle Andrew, who knew nothing about the wood between worlds, had quite a wrong idea about the rings. The yellow ones weren't for outward rings, and the green ones weren't for homeward rings. At least, not in the way he thought. The stuff of which both were made of had all come from the wood. The stuff in the yellow rings had the power of drawing you into the wood. It was the stuff that wanted to get back to its own place, the in-between place. But the stuff in the green rings was the stuff that was trying to get out of its own place, so that a green ring would take you out of the wood into a world. Uncle Andrew, you see, was working with things he did not really understand. Most magicians are. Of course, Diggory did not realize the truth quite clearly either, or not until later. But then they had talked it over. They decided to try the green rings on the new pool, just to see what happened. "I'm game if you are," said Polly. But she really said this because, in her heart of hearts, she now felt sure that neither kind of ring was going to work at all in the new pool, and so there was nothing worse to be afraid of, other than another splash. I'm not quite sure that Diggory had the same feeling. At any rate, when they both put on their greens and come back to the edge of the water, and taken hands again, they were certainly a good deal more cheerful and less solemn than they had been the first time. "1, 2, 3, go!" said Diggory, and they jumped. There had been no doubt about the magic this time. Down and down they rushed, first through darkness, and then through a mass of vague and whirling shapes which might have been almost anything. It grew lighter. Then suddenly they felt that they had been standing on something solid. A moment later everything came into focus, and they were able to look about them. "What a strange place," said Diggory. "I don't like it," said Polly, with something like a shudder. What they noticed first was the light. It wasn't like sunlight. It wasn't like electric light, or lamps, or candles, or anything or any other light that they had ever seen. It was a dull, rather red light, not at all cheerful. It was steady, and it did not flicker. They were standing on a flat paved surface, and buildings rose all around them. There was no roof overhead. They were in a sort of courtyard. The sky was extraordinarily dark, a blue that was almost black. When you had seen the sky, you wondered that there should be any light at all. "It's very funny weather here," said Diggory. "I wonder if we've just arrived in a time for a thunderstorm or an eclipse." "I don't like it," said Polly. Both of them, without knowing why, were talking in whispers. And though there was no reason why they should still go on holding hands after their jump, they didn't let go. Under the sea. You didn't let me know. I missed first, you turd. You're a butt. You making rice too? Okay, I want rice. Bye bye. The walls rose very high all around that courtyard. They had many great windows in them, windows without glass, through which you saw nothing but black darkness. Lower down there were great pillared arches, yawning black like the mouths of railway tunnels. It was rather cold. The stone on which everything was built seemed to be red, but that might only be because of the curious light. It was obviously very old. Many of the flat stones that paved the courtyard had cracks across them. None of them fitted closely together, and the sharp corners were all worn off. One of the arched doorways was half filled up with rubble. The two children kept on turning round and round to look at the different sides of the courtyard. One reason that they were afraid of somebody or something looking out of those windows at them when their backs were turned. "Do you think anyone lives here?" said Diggory at last, still in a whisper. "No," said Polly. "It's all in ruins. We haven't heard a sound since we came." "Let's stand still and listen for a bit," suggested Diggory. They stood still and listened, but all they could hear was the thump-thump of their own hearts. This place was at least as quiet as the wood between worlds, but it was a different kind of quietness. The silence of the wood had been rich and warm. You could almost hear the trees growing, and full of life. This was dead, cold, empty silence. You couldn't imagine anything growing in it. "Let's go home," said Polly. "But we haven't seen anything yet," said Diggory. "And now we're here, we simply must have a look around. I'm sure there's nothing at all interesting here. There's not much point in finding a magic ring that lets you look into other worlds if you're afraid to look at them when you've got there." "Who's talking about being afraid?" said Polly, letting go of Diggory's hand. "I only thought you didn't seem very keen on exploring this place. I'll go anywhere you go." "We can get away the moment we want to," said Diggory. "Let's take off our green rings and put them in our right-hand pockets. All we've got to do is remember that our yellows are in our left-hand pockets. You can keep your hand as near your pocket as you like, but don't put it in or you'll touch your yellow and vanish." They did this and went quietly up to one of the big arched doorways which led to the inside of the building, and then they stood on the threshold and could look in. They saw it was not so dark inside as they first thought. It led into a vast shadowy hall which appeared to be empty. But on the far side there was a row of pillars with arches between them, and through those arches were streamed in some more there streamed in some more of the same tired-looking light. They crossed the hall, walking very carefully for fear of holes in the floor or of anything lying about that they might trip over. It seemed a long walk. When they had reached the other side, they came out through the arches and found themselves in another large courtyard. No. Mhm. That doesn't look very safe, said Polly, pointing at a place where the wall bulged outward and looked as if it were ready to fall over into the courtyard. In one place a pillar was missing, between two arches, and the bit that came down to where the top of the pillar ought to have been hanging, there was nothing to support it. Clearly, the place had been deserted for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. If it's lasted till now, I suppose it'll last a bit longer, said Diggory, but we must be very quiet. You know a noise sometimes brings things down, like an avalanche in the Alps. They went on out to the courtyard, into another doorway, and up a great flight of steps, and through vast rooms that opened out into another till you were dizzy with the mere size of the place. Every now and then they thought they were going to get out into the open and see what sort of country lay around the enormous palace, but each time they only got into another courtyard. They must have been magnificent places, where people were still living there. In one there had been a fountain. A great stone monster with widespread wings stood with its mouth open, and you could still see a bit of pipe in the back of its mouth, out of which the water used to pour. Under it was a wide stone basin to hold the water, but it was as dry as a bone. In other places there were dry sticks of some sort of climbing plant, which had wound itself around the pillars and helped to pull some of them down, but it had died long ago, and there were no ants or spiders or any of the other living things you expect to see in a ruin, and where the dry earth showed between the broken flagstones, there was no grass or moss. It was all so dreamy and all so much the same that even Diggory was thinking they had better put on their yellow rings and get back to the warm, green, living forest of the in-between place, when they came to two huge doors of some metal that might possibly be gold. One stood a little ajar, so of course they went to go look in. Both started back and drew a long breath, for here at last was something worth seeing. For a second they thought the room was full of people, hundreds of people, all seated and all perfectly still. Polly and Diggory, as you may guess, stood perfectly still themselves for a good long time looking in, but presently they decided that what they were looking at could not be real people. There was no movement nor the sound of breathing among them all. They were almost like wondrous waxworks you ever saw. This time Polly took the lead. There was something in this room which interested her more than it interested Diggory. All the figures were wearing magnificent clothes. If you were interested in clothes at all, you could hardly help going in to see them closer, and the blaze of their colors made this room look, not exactly cheerful, but at any rate rich and majestic after all the dust and emptiness of the others. It had more windows, too, and it was a good deal lighter. I can hardly describe the clothes. The figures were all robed and had crowns on their heads. Their robes were of crimson and silver gray and deep purple and vivid green, and there were patterns and pictures of flowers and strange beasts in needlework all over them. Precious stones of astonishing size and brightness stared from their crowns and hung in chains around their necks and peered out from all the places where anything was fastened. Why haven't these clothes all rotted away long ago? Asked Polly. Magic, whispered Diggory. Can't you feel it? I bet this whole room is just stiff with enchantments. I could feel it the moment we came in. Any one of these dresses would cost hundreds of pounds, said Polly, but Diggory was more interested in the faces. And indeed, these were well worth looking at. The people sat in their stone chairs on each side of the room, and the floor was left free down the middle. You could walk down and look at each faces in turn. These were nice people, I think, said Diggory. Polly nodded. All the faces they could see were certainly nice. Both the men and women looked kind and wise, but they seemed to come of a handsome race. But after the children had gone a few steps down the room, they came to faces that looked a little different. These were very solemn faces. You felt you would have to mind your P's and Q's if you ever met living people who looked like that. And then, when they had gone a little farther, they found themselves among faces they didn't like. This was about the middle of the room. The faces here looked very strong and proud and happy, but they looked crueler. A little farther on, and they looked crueler. Farther on again, they were still cruel, but they no longer looked happy. They were even despairing faces, as if the people they belonged to had done dreadful things and also suffered dreadful things. The last figure of all was the most interesting, a woman even more richly dressed than the others, very tall, but every figure in the room was taller than the people in our world, with a look of such fierceness and pride that it took your breath away. Yet she was very beautiful too. Years afterward, when he was an old man, Diggory said he had never in all his life known a woman so beautiful. It was only fair to add that Polly always said she couldn't see anything specially beautiful about her. This woman, as I said, was the last, but there were plenty of empty chairs beyond her, as if the room had been intended for a much larger collection of images. I do wish we knew the story that's behind all this, said Diggory. Let's go back and look at the table sort of thing in the middle of the room. The thing in the middle of the room was not exactly a table. It was a square pillar about 4 feet high, and on it there rose a little golden arch, from which there hung a little golden bell, and beside this there lay a little golden hammer to hit the bell with. I wonder, I wonder, I wonder, said Diggory. There seems to be something written here, said Polly, stooping down and looking at the side of the pillar. By gum, so there is, said Diggory. But of course we shan't be able to read it. Shan't we? I'm not so sure, said Polly. They both looked at it hard, and, as you might have expected, the letters cut into stone were strange. But now a great wonder happened, for as they looked, though the shape of the letters never altered, they found that they could understand them. If only Diggory had remembered what he himself had said a few minutes ago, that this was an enchanted room, he might have guessed that the enchantment was beginning to work. But he was too wild with curiosity to think about that. He was longing more and more to know what was written on the pillar, and very soon they both knew. What it said was something like this. At least, this is the sense of it through the poetry. When you read it here, it was better. Make your choice, adventurous stranger. Strike the bell and bide the danger, or wonder till it drives you mad. What would have followed if you had? No fear, said Polly. We don't want any danger. Oh, but don't you see it's no good, said Diggory. We can't get out of it now. We shall always be wondering what else would have happened if we had struck the bell. I'm not going home to be driven mad by always thinking of that. No fear. Don't be so silly, said Polly. If anyone would, what does it matter that would have happened? I expect anyone who's come as far as this is bound to go on wandering till it seems him dotty. That's the magic of it, you see. I can already feel it beginning to work on me already. Well, I don't, said Polly crossly, and I don't believe you do either. You're just putting it on. That's all you know, said Diggory. It's because you're a girl. Girls never want to know anything but gossip and rot about people getting engaged. You look exactly like your uncle when you said that, said Polly. Can't you keep to the point, said Diggory. What we're talking about is— How exactly like a man, said Polly, in a very grown-up voice, but she added hastily, in her real voice, and don't say I'm just like a woman, or you'll be a beastly copycat. I should never dream of calling a kid like you a woman, said Diggory loftily. Oh, I'm a kid, am I? Said Polly, who was now in a real rage. Well, you needn't be bothered by having a kid with you any longer then. I'm off. I've had enough of this place. And I've had enough of you too. You beastly stuck-up obstinate pig. None of that, said Diggory, in a voice even nastier than he'd meant it to be, for he saw Polly's hand moving to her pocket to get a hold of her yellow ring. I can't excuse what he did next, except by saying that he was very sorry for it afterward, and so were a good many other people. Before Polly's hand reached her pocket, he grabbed her wrist, leading her across leaning across her with his back against her chest. Then, keeping her other arm out of the way of his other elbow, leaned forward, picked up the hammer, and struck the golden bell with a light, smart tap. Then let her go, and they fell apart, staring at each other and breathing loudly. Polly was just beginning to cry, not with fear, and not even because he had hurt her wrist quite badly, but with furious anger. Within 2 seconds, however, they had something to think about that drove their own quarrels quite out of their minds. As soon as the bell was struck, it gave out a note, a sweet note, such as you might have expected, and not very loud, but instead of dying away again, it went on, and as it went on it grew louder. Before a minute had passed, it was twice as loud as it had been to begin with. It was soon so loud that if the children had tried to speak, but they weren't thinking of speaking now, they were just standing there with their mouths open, they would not have heard one another. Very soon it was so loud that they could not have heard one another even by shouting, and still it grew, all on one note, a continuous sweet sound, though the sweetness had something horrible about it, till all the air in that great room was throbbing with it, and they could feel the stone floor trembling under their feet. Then at last it began to be mixed with another sound, a vague, disastrous noise, which sounded first like a roar of a distant train, then like the crash of a falling tree. They heard something like a great weights falling, finally, with a sudden rush, and thunder, and a shake that nearly flung them off their feet. About a quarter of the roof at one end of the room fell in. Great blocks of masonry fell all around them, and the walls rocked. The noise of the bell stopped. The clouds of dust cleared away. Everything became quiet again. It was never found out whether the fall of the roof was due to magic, or whether that unbearably loud sound from the bell just happened to strike the note, which was more than those crumbling walls could stand. There, I hope you're satisfied now, panted Polly. Well, it's all over anyway, said Diggory, and both thought it was, but they had never been more mistaken in their lives. The children were facing one another across the pillar where the bell had rung. Still trembling, though it was no longer gave out any note. Suddenly they heard a soft noise from the end of the room, which was still undamaged. They turned as quick as lightning to see what it was. One of the robed figures, the furthest off one of all, the woman whom Diggory thought was so beautiful, was rising from its chair. When she stood up, they realized that she was even taller than they had thought, and you could see at once, not only from her crown and robes, but from the flash of her eyes and the curve of her lips, that she was a great queen. She looked round the room and saw the damage and then saw the children, but she could not guess from her face what she thought of either, or whether she was surprised. She came forward with long, swift strides. Who has awakened me? Who has broken the spell? She asked. I think it must have been me, said Diggory. You, said the queen, laying her hand on his shoulder, a white, beautiful hand, but Diggory could feel that it was strong as steel pincers. You? But you're only a child, a common child. Anyone can see at a glance that you have no drop of royal or noble blood in your veins. How did such as you dare enter this house? We've come from another world, by magic, said Polly, who thought it was high time the Queen took some notice of her as well as Diggory. Is this true? Said the Queen, still looking at Diggory, and not giving Polly even a glance. Yes, it is, he said. The Queen put her other hand under his chin and forced it up so that she could see his face better. Diggory tried to stare back, but he soon had to let his eyes drop. There was something about her eyes that overpowered him. After she had studied him for well over a minute, she let go of his chin and said, "You are no magician. The mark of it is not on you. You must be only the servant of a magician. It was on another another's magic that you have traveled here." "It was my Uncle Andrew," said Diggory. At that moment, not in the room itself, but from somewhere very close, there came, first a rumbling, then a creaking, and then a roar of falling masonry, and the floor shook. "There is great peril here," said the Queen. "The whole palace is breaking up, and if we are not out of it in a few minutes, we shall be buried under the ruin." She spoke as calmly as if she had been merely mentioning the time of day. "Come," she added, and held out her hand to each of the children. Polly, who was disliking the Queen, and feeling rather sulky, would not have let her hand be taken if she could have helped it. But though the Queen spoke so calmly, her movements were as quick as thought. Before Polly knew what was happening, her left hand had been caught in a hand so much larger and stronger than her own that she could do nothing about it. "This is a terrible woman," thought Polly. "She is strong enough to break my arm with one twist, and now that she has got my left hand, I can't get at my yellow ring. If I tried to stretch across and get my right hand into my left pocket, I mightn't be able to reach it before she asked me what I was doing. Whatever happens, we mustn't let her know about the rings. I do hope Diggory has the sense to keep his mouth shut. I wish I could get a word with him alone." The Queen led them out through the hall of the images into the long corridor, and then through a whole maze of halls and stairs and courtyards. Again and again they heard parts of the great palace collapsing, sometimes quite close to them. Once a huge arch came thundering down only a moment after they had passed through it. The Queen was walking quickly, and the children had to trot to keep up with her. But she showed no sign of fear. Diggory thought, "She's wonderfully brave and strong. She's what I call a queen. I do hope she's going to tell us a story of this place." She did tell them certain things as they went along. "That is the door to the dungeons," she would say, or "that passage leads to the principal torture chambers," or "this was the old banqueting hall where my great-grandfather bade 700 nobles to feast and killed them all before they had drunk their fill." They had their rebellious thoughts. They came at last into a large hall, and loftier than any they had seen. From its size, from the great doors to the far end, Diggory thought that now at last they must be coming to the main entrance. In this he was quite right. The doors were dead black, either ebony or some black metal which is not found in our world. They were fastened with great bars, most of them too high to reach, and all too heavy to lift. He wondered how they would get out. The Queen let go of his hand and raised her arm. She drew herself up to her full height and stood rigid. Then she said something which they couldn't understand, but it sounded horrible, and made an action as if she were to throw something toward the doors. And those high and heavy doors trembled for a second, as if they were made of silk, and then crumbled away till there was nothing left of them but a heap of dust on the threshold. "Whew!" whistled Diggory. "Has your master magician, your uncle, power like mine?" asked the Queen, firmly seizing Diggory's hand. "But I shall know later. In the meantime, remember what you have seen. This is what happens to things and to people who stand in my way." Much more light than they had yet seen in that country was pouring through the now empty doorway, and when the Queen had led them out through it, they were not surprised to find themselves in the open air. The wind that blew in their faces was cold, yet somehow stale. They were looking from a high terrace, and there was a great landscape spread out below them. Low down and near the horizon hung a great red sun, far bigger than our own sun. Diggory felt at once that It was also older than ours, a sun near the end of its life, weary of looking down upon the world. To the left of the sun, and higher up, there was a single star, big and bright. Those were the only two things that could be seen in the dark sky. They made a dismal group, and on the earth, in every direction, as far as the eye could reach, there spread a vast city in which there was no living thing to be seen. And all the temples, towers, palaces, pyramids, and bridges cast long, disastrous-looking shadows in the light of the withered sun. Once a great river had flowed through the city, but the water had long since vanished, and there was now only a wide ditch of gray dust. "Look well on which no eyes will ever see again," said the Queen. Such was Charn, that great city, the city of the King of Kings, the wonder of the world, perhaps of all worlds. Does your uncle rule a city as great as this, boy? No, said Diggory. He was going to explain that Uncle Andrew didn't rule any cities, but the Queen went on. It is silent now, but I have stood here when the whole air was full of the noises of Charn, the trampling of feet, the creaking of wheels, the crackling of the whips and the groaning of slaves, the thunder of chariots, and the sacrificial drums beating in the temples. I have stood here, but that was near the end, when the roar of battle went up from every street, and the river of Charn ran red. She paused and added, all in one moment one woman blotted it out forever. Who? Said Diggory, in a faint voice, but he had already guessed the answer. I, said the Queen, I, Jadis, the last queen, but the queen of the world. The two children stood silent, shivering in the cold wind. It was my sister's fault, said the Queen. She drove me to it. May the curse of all the powers rest upon her forever. At any moment I was ready to make peace, yes, and to spare her life too, if only she would yield me the throne. But she would not. Her pride has destroyed the whole world. Even after the war had begun, there was a solemn promise that neither side would use magic. But when she broke her promise, what could I do? Fool. As if she did not know that I had more magic than she. She even knew that I had the secret of the deplorable word. Did she think, she was always a weakling, that I would not use it? What was it? Said Diggory. That was the secret of secrets, said the Queen Jadis. It had long been known that the great kings of our race, there was such a word which, if spoken with the proper ceremonies, would destroy all living things except the one who spoke it. But the ancient kings were weak and soft-hearted, and bound themselves, and all who should come after them with great oaths, never to seek after the knowledge of the word. But I learned it in a secret place, and paid a terrible price to learn it. I did not use it until she forced me to. I fought to overcome her by every other means. I poured out the blood of my armies like water. Beast, muttered Polly. The last great battle, said the Queen, raged for 3 days here in Charn itself. For 3 days I looked down upon it from this very spot. I did not use my power till the last of my soldiers had fallen. And that accursed woman, my sister, at the head of her rebels, was halfway up those great stairs that led up to the city from the terrace. Then I waited till we were so close that we could see one another's faces. She flashed her horrible, wicked eyes upon me and said, "Victory." Yes, said I, victory, but not yours. Then I spoke the deplorable word. A moment later I was the only living thing beneath the sun. But the people, gasped Diggory. What people, boy? Asked the Queen. All the ordinary people, said Polly, who'd never done you any harm, and the women, and the children, and the animals. Don't you understand? Said the Queen, still speaking to Diggory. I was the Queen. They were all my people. What else was there? What else were they there for but to do my will? It was rather hard luck on them, all the same, thought he. I had forgotten that you are only a common boy. How should you understand reasons of state? You must learn, child. That would be wrong for you, or for any of the common people, is not wrong for a great queen such as I. The weight of the world is on our shoulders. We must be freed from all rules. Ours is a high and lonely destiny. Diggory suddenly remembered that Uncle Andrew had used exactly the same words, but they sounded much grander when Queen Jadis said them, perhaps because Uncle Andrew was not 7 feet tall and dazzlingly beautiful. "What did you do then?" said Diggory. "I had already cast strong spells on the hall where the images of my ancestors sit, and the force of those spells was that I should sleep among them, like an image myself, and neither need food nor fire, though it was well 1,000 years till one came and struck the bell, and awoke me." "Was it the deplorable word that made the sun like that?" asked Diggory. "Like what?" said Jadis. "So big, so red, and so cold." "It has always been so," said Jadis, "at least for hundreds of thousands of years." "Have you a different sort of sun in your world?" "Yes, it's smaller and yellower, and it gives a good deal more heat." The Queen gave a long-drawn "Aha!" and Diggory saw on her face that same hungry and greedy look which he had seen lately on Uncle Andrew's. "So," she said, "yours is a younger world." She paused for a moment to look once more at the deserted city, and if she was sorry for all the evil she had done there, she certainly didn't show it, and then said, "Now, let us be going. It is cold here at the end of all the ages." "Going where?" asked both children. "To where?" repeated Jadis in surprise. "To your world, of course." Polly and Diggory looked at each other aghast. Polly had disliked the Queen from the first, and even Diggory, now that he had learned the story, felt that he had seen quite as much of her as he wanted. Certainly she was not at all the sort of person one would like to take home, and, if they did like, they didn't know how they could. What they wanted was to get away themselves. But Polly couldn't get at her ring, and of course Diggory couldn't go without her. Diggory had got very red in the face and stammered, "Uh, our our world? I didn't know you wanted to go there." "What else were you sent here for if not to fetch me?" asked Jadis. "I'm sure you wouldn't like our world at all," said Diggory. "It's not her sort of place, is it, Polly? It's very dull, not worth seeing, really." "It will soon be worth seeing when I rule it," answered the Queen. "Oh, but you can't," said Diggory. "It's not like that. They wouldn't let you, you know." The Queen gave a contemptuous smile. "Many great kings," she said, "thought they could stand against the House of Charn, but they all fell, and their very names are forgotten. Foolish boy, do you think that I, with my beauty and my magic, will not have your whole world at my feet before a year has passed? Prepare your incantations and take me there at once." "This is perfectly frightful," said Diggory to Polly. "Perhaps you fear for this uncle of yours," said Jadis. "But if he honors me duly, he shall keep his life and his throne. I am not coming to fight against him. He must be a very great magician if he has found out how to send you here. Is he king of your whole world, or only a part?" "He isn't king of anywhere," said Diggory. "You are lying," said the Queen. "Does not magic always go with royal blood? Who ever heard of common people being magicians? I can see the truth whenever you speak or not. Your uncle is the great king and the great enchanter of your world, and by his art he has seen the shadow of my face in some magic mirror or some enchanted pool, and for the love of my beauty he has made a potent spell which shook your world to its foundations and sent you across the vast gulf between world and world to ask my favor and bring me to him. Answer me. Is that not how it was?" "Well, not exactly," said Diggory. "Not exactly," shouted Polly. "Why, it's absolutely bosh from beginning to end." "Minions!" cried the Queen, turning in rage upon Polly and seizing her hair at the very top of her head where it hurts most. And in so doing she let go of both children's hands. "Now!" shouted Diggory. And "Quick!" shouted Polly. They plunged their left hands into their pockets. They did not even need to put the rings on. The moment they touched them, the whole of that dreary world vanished from their eyes. They were rushing upward, and a warm green light was growing nearer overhead. Let go! Let go! Screamed Polly. I'm not touching you, said Diggory. Then their heads came out of the pool, and, once more, the sunny quietness of the wood between worlds was all about them, and it seemed richer and warmer and more peaceful than ever after the staleness and ruin of the place they had just left. I think that, if they had been given the chance, they would again have forgotten who they were and where they came from, and would have lain down and enjoyed themselves, half asleep, listening to the growing of the trees. But this time there was something that kept them as wide awake as possible, for as soon as they had got out onto the grass they found that they were not alone. The Queen, or the Witch, whichever you'd like to call her, had come up with them, holding on fast by Polly's hair. That was why Polly had been shouting out, "Let go." This proved, by the way, another thing about the rings which Uncle Andrew hadn't told Diggory because he hadn't known it himself. In order to jump from world to world by one of those rings, you don't need to be wearing or touching it yourself. It is enough if you are touching someone who is touching it. In that way, they work like a magnet. And everyone knows that if you pick up a pin with a magnet, any other pins which is touching the first pin will come too. Now that you saw her in the wood, Queen Jadis looked different. She was much paler than she had been, so pale that hardly any of her beauty was left, and she was stooped and seemed to be finding it hard to breathe, as if the air of the place stifled her. Neither of the children felt in the least afraid of her now. Let go! Let go of my hair, said Polly. What do you mean by it? Here, let go of her hair at once, said Diggory. They both turned and struggled with her. They were stronger than her, and in a few seconds they had forced her to let go. She reeled back, panting, and there was a look of terror in her eyes. Quick, Diggory, said Polly. Change rings and go to the home pool. Help! Help! Mercy! cried the witch in a faint voice, staggering after them. Take me with you. You cannot leave me in this horrendous place. It's killing me. It's a reason of state, said Polly spitefully, like when you killed all those people in your own world. Do be quick, Diggory. They had put on their green rings, but Diggory said, Oh, bother, what are we going to do? He couldn't help feeling a little sorry for the Queen. Oh, don't be such an ass, said Polly. 10 to 1 she's only shamming. Do come on. And then both children plunged into the home pool. It's a good thing we made that mark, thought Polly, but as they jumped, Diggory felt that a large cold finger and thumb had caught him by the ear, and as they sank down, and a confused shapes of her own world began to appear, the grip of that finger and thumb grew stronger. The witch was apparently recovering her strength. Diggory struggled and kicked, but it was not in the least use. In a moment they found themselves in Uncle Andrew's study, and there was Uncle Andrew himself, staring at the wonderful creature that Diggory had brought back from the world beyond. As well as he might stare, Diggory and Polly stared too. There was no doubt that the witch had got over her faintness, and now that one saw her in our own world, with ordinary things about her, she fairly took one's breath away. In Charn she had been alarmingly enough. In London she was terrifying. For one thing, they had not realized till now how very big she was. Hardly human was what Diggory thought when he looked at her, and he may have been right, for some say there is giantish blood in the royal family of Charn, but even her height was nothing compared with her beauty, her fierceness, and her wildness. She looked 10 times more alive than most people on the streets of London. Uncle Andrew was bowing and rubbing his hands and looking, to tell the truth, extremely frightened. He seemed like a little shrimp of a creature beside the witch, and yet, as Polly said afterward, there was a sort of likeness between her face and his, something in the expression. It was the look of all the wicked magicians have, the mark which Jadis had said she could not find in Diggory's face. One good thing about seeing the two together was that you would never again be afraid of Uncle Andrew, and any more than you'd be afraid of a worm after you'd met a rattlesnake, or anything, or afraid of a cow after you'd met a mad bull. Pooh, thought Diggory to himself. Him, a magician? Not much. Now she's the real thing. Uncle Andrew kept on rubbing his hands and bowing. He was trying to say something very polite, but his mouth had gone all dry so that he could not speak. His experiment with the rings, as he called it, was turning out more successful than he liked, for though he had dabbled in magic for years, he had always left all the dangers, as far as one can, to other people. Nothing at all like this had ever happened to him. Then Jadis spoke, not very loud, but there was something in her voice that made the whole room quiver. "Where is the magician who has called me to this world?" "Ah, madam," gasped Uncle Andrew, "I am most honored, highly gratified, a most unexpected pleasure. If only I had the opportunity of making any preparations, I "Where is the magician, fool?" said Jadis. "I I am, madam. I hope you will excuse any liberty these naughty children have taken. I assure you there was no intention." "You?" said the Queen, in a still more terrible voice. Then in one stride she crossed the room, seized a great handful of Uncle Andrew's gray hair, and pulled his head back so that his face looked up into hers. Then he studied his face, just as she had studied Diggory's face in the palace of Charn. He blinked and licked his dry lips nervously all the time. At last she let him go, so suddenly that he reeled back against the wall. "I see," she said scornfully. "You are a magician, of a sort. Stand up, dog. Don't sprawl there as if you were speaking to your equals. How do you come to know magic? You are not of royal blood, I'll swear." "Well, not perhaps in the strict sense," stammered Uncle Andrew. "Not exactly royal, ma'am. The Ketterleys are, however, a very old family. An old Dorsetshire family, ma'am." "Peace," said the witch. "I see what you are. You are a little peddling magician who works by rules and books. There is no real magic in your blood and heart. Your kind was made an end of it in my world thousands of years ago. But here I shall allow you to be my servant. I should be most happy, delighted to be of any service. A pleasure, I assure you." "Peace. You talk far too much. Listen to your first task. I see we are in a large city. Procure for me at once a chariot, or a flying carpet, or a well-trained dragon, or whatever is usual for royal and noble persons in this land. Then bring me to places where I can get clothes and jewels and slaves fit for my rank. Tomorrow I will begin my conquest of the world. I I I'll go and order a cab at once," gaped Uncle Andrew. "Stop," said the witch, just as he reached the door. "Do not dream of treachery. My eyes can see through walls and into the minds of men. They will be on you wherever you go. At the first sign of disobedience, I will lay such spells on you that anything you sit down on will feel like red-hot iron, and whenever you lie in a bed there will be invisible blocks of ice at your feet. Now go." The old man went out, looking like a dog with its tail between its legs. The children were now afraid that Jadis would have something to say to them about what had happened in the wood. As it turned out, however, she never made mention it either then or afterward. To think, and Diggory thinks too, that her mind was of a sort which cannot remember that quiet place at all, and however often you took her there, and however long you left her there, she would still know nothing about it, though that was now that she was left alone with the children, she took no notice of either of them, and that was like her too. In Charn she had taken no notice of Polly till the very end, because Diggory was the one she wanted to make use of. Now she had Uncle Andrew, she took no notice of Diggory. I expect most witches are like that. They are not interested in things or people unless they can use them. They are terribly practical. So there was silence in the room for a minute or two, but you could tell by the way Jadis tapped her foot on the floor that she was growing impatient. Presently she said, as if to herself, "What is the old fool doing? I should have brought a whip." She stalked out of the room in pursuit of Uncle Andrew without one glance at the children. "Whew!" said Polly, letting out a long breath of relief. "And now I must get home. It's frightfully late. I shall catch it." "Will do. Do come back as soon as you can," said Diggory. "This is simply gas, having her here. We must make some sort of plan." "It's up to your uncle now," said Polly. "It was he who started all this mess about magic. All the same, you will come back, won't you? Hang it all, you can't leave me alone in a scrap like this." "I shall go home by the tunnel," said Polly, rather coldly. "That's the quickest way. And if you want me to come back, hadn't you better say you're sorry?" "Sorry!" exclaimed Diggory. "Well now, if that isn't just like a girl. What have I done?" "Oh, nothing, of course," said Polly sarcastically. "Only nearly screwed my wrists off in that room with all the waxworks, like a cowardly bully. Only struck the bell with the hammer, like a silly idiot. Only turned back in the woods so that she had time to catch hold of you before we jumped into our own pool. That's all." "Oh," said Diggory, very surprised. "Well, all right. I'll say I'm sorry. And I really am sorry about what happened in the waxworks room. There, I said I'm sorry. And now, do be decent and come back. I shall be frightened whole if you don't. I don't see what's going to happen to you. It's Mr. Ketterly who's going to sit on red-hot chairs and have ice in his bed, isn't it?" "It isn't that sort of thing," said Diggory. "What I'm bothered about is Mother. Suppose that creature went into her room. She might frighten her to death." "Oh, I see," said Polly in a rather different voice. "All right. We'll call it a pax. I'll come back if I can, but I must go now." And she crawled through the little door into the tunnel, and that dark place among the rafters, which seemed so exciting and adventurous a few hours ago, seemed quite tame and homely now. We must go back to Uncle Andrew. His poor old heart went pit-a-pat as he struggled down the attic stairs, and he kept on dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. Then he reached his bedroom, which was the first floor below. He locked himself in, and the first thing he did was to grope in the wardrobe for a bottle and a wine-glass, which he always kept hidden there where Aunt Letty could not find them. He poured himself out a glassful of some nasty grown-up drink, and drank it off at one gulp. Then he drew a deep breath. "Upon my word," he said to himself, "I'm dreadfully shaken. Most upsetting, and at my time of life." He poured out a second glass and drank it too, and then he began to change his clothes. You have never seen such clothes, but I can remember them. He put on very high, shiny, stiff collar of the sort, and made you hold your chin up all the time. He put on a white waistcoat with a pattern on it, and arranged his gold chain watch across the front. He put on his best frock, and or the one that kept 4 weddings and funerals. He got out his best tall hat and polished it up. There was a vase of flowers, put there by Aunt Letty, on his dressing table. He took one and put it in his buttonhole. Then he took a clean handkerchief, a lovely one, as you couldn't buy today, out of the little left-hand drawer and put a few drops of scent on it. He took his eyeglasses, with the thick black ribbon, and screwed it onto his eye. Then he looked at himself in the mirror. Children have one kind of silliness, as you know, and grown-ups have another kind. At this moment Uncle Andrew was beginning to be silly in a very grown-up way, and now that witch was no longer in the same room with him, he was quickly forgetting that had frightened him, and thinking more and more of her wondrous beauty. He kept on saying to himself, "A dem fine woman, sir, a dem fine woman, a superb creature." He had also somehow managed to forget that it was the children who had got a hold of this superb creature. He felt as if he himself by his magic had called her out of unknown worlds. "Andrew, my boy," he said to himself as he looked in the glass, "you're a devilish well-preserved fellow for your age. A distinguished-looking man, sir." You see, the foolish old man was actually beginning to imagine the witch would fall in love with him. 2 drinks probably had something to do with it, and so had his best clothes. But he was, in any case, as vain as a peacock. That was why he had become a magician. He unlocked the door, went downstairs, sent the housemaid to fetch a hansom (everyone had a lot of servants in those days), and looked into the drawing-room. There, as he expected, he found Aunt Letty. She was busily mending a mattress. It lay on the floor near the window, and she was kneeling on it. Uh, Let Letitia, my dear, said Uncle Andrew, I have to go out. Just lend me £5 or so. There's a good gel. Gel is the way he pronounced girl, or gel. No, Andrew dear, said Aunt Letty in her firm, quiet voice, without looking up from her work. I told you times without number that I will not lend you money. Now, pray, don't be troublesome, my dear gal, said Uncle Andrew. It's most important. You'll put me in a deucedly awkward position if you don't. Andrew, said Aunt Letty, looking him straight in the face, I wonder you are not ashamed to ask me for money. It was a long, dull story of a grown-up kind behind these words. All you need to know about it was that Uncle Andrew, with what with managing dear Letty's business matters for her, and never doing any work, and running up large bills for brandy and cigars, which Aunt Letty had paid again and again, and made her a good deal poorer than she had been 30 years ago. My dear girl, said Uncle Andrew, you don't understand. I shall have some quite unexpected expenses today. I have to do a little entertaining. Come now, don't be tiresome. And who, pray tell, are you going to entertain, Andrew? Said Aunt Letty. A most distinguished visitor has just arrived. Distinguished fiddlestick, said Aunt Letty. There was there hasn't been a ring at the bell for the last hour. At that moment the door was suddenly flung open. Aunt Letty looked around and saw with amazement that an enormous woman, splendidly dressed, with bare arms and flashing eyes, stood in the doorway. It was the witch. Now, slave, how long do I have to wait for my chariot? Thundered the witch. Uncle Andrew cowered away from her. Now that she was really present, all the silly thoughts he had while looking at himself in the glass were oozing out of him. But Aunt Letty at once got up from her knees and came over to the center of the room. And who is this young person, Andrew, may I ask? Said Aunt Letty with icy tones. Distinguished foreigner, very important person, he stammered. Rubbish, said Aunt Letty. And then, turning to the witch, get out of my house this moment, you shameless hussy, or I'll send for the police. She thought the witch must be someone out of a circus, and she did not approve of bare arms. What woman is this? Said Jadis. Down on your knees, minion, before I blast you. No strong language in this house, if you please, young woman, said Aunt Letty. Instantly, as it seemed to Uncle Andrew, the queen towered up to an even greater height. Fire flashed from her eyes. She flung out her arm with the same gesture, and the same horrible-sounding words that had lately turned the palace gates of charm to dust. But nothing happened, except that Aunt Letty, thinking those horrible words were meant to be ordinary English, said, I thought as much. The woman is drunk. Drunk! She can't even speak clearly. It must have been a terrible moment for the witch when she suddenly realized that her power of turning people into dust, which had been quite real in her world, was not going to work in ours. But she did not lose her nerve even for a second. Without wasting a thought on her disappointment, she lunged forward, caught Aunt Letty around her neck and the knees, raised her high above her head as if she had been no heavier than a doll, and threw her across the room. While Aunt Letty was still hurling through the air, the housemaid, who was having a beautifully exciting morning, put her head out the door and said, If you please, sir, the Ansom's come. Lead on, slave, said the witch to the Uncle Andrew. He began muttering something about regrettable violence. Must really protest. But at a single glance from Jadis he became speechless. She drove him out of the room and out of the house. And Diggory came running down the stairs, just in time to see the front door close behind them. Jiminy, he said, she's loose in London, and with Uncle Andrew. I wonder what on earth is going to happen now. Oh, Master Diggory, said the housemaid, who was really having a wonderful day, I think Miss Ketterly's hurt herself somehow. So they both rushed into the drawing-room to find out what had happened. If Aunt Letty had fallen on bare boards, or even on the carpet, I suppose all her bones would have been broken. But, by great good luck, she had fallen on the mattress. Aunt Letty was a very tough old lady. Aunts often were in those days. After she had some sal volatile and sat still for a few minutes, she said there was nothing the matter with her except a few bruises. Very soon she was taking charge of the situation. "Sarah," she said to the housemaid, who had never said much in a day before, "go around to the police station at once, and tell them there is a dangerous lunatic at large. I will take Mrs. Kirk's lunch up to myself." Mrs. Kirk was, of course, Diggory's mother. When Mother's lunch had been seen to, Diggory and Aunt Letty had their own. After that he did some hard thinking. The problem was how to get the witch back into her own world, or at the very rate that out of ours, as soon as possible. Whatever happened, she must not be allowed to go rampaging about the house. Mother must not see her, and if possible, she must not be allowed to go rampaging about London either. Diggory had not been in the drawing room when she tried to blast Aunt Letty, but he had seen her blast the gates of Charn, so he knew her terrible powers and did not know she had lost any of them coming into our world. And she knew, and he knew she meant to conquer our world. At the present moment, as far as he could see, she might be blasting Buckingham Palace or the Houses of Parliament, and it was almost certain that quite a number of policemen had by now been reduced to heaps of dust. There hadn't there hadn't seemed to be anything he could do about that. But the rings seemed to work like magnets, thought Diggory. If I can only touch her and slip on my yellow, we shall both be in the world between worlds. I wonder, will she go all faint again there? Was that something the place does to her? Or was it only the shock of being pulled out of her own world? I suppose I'll have to risk that. And how am I to find the beast? I don't suppose Aunt Letty would let me go out. Not unless I said where I was going, and I haven't got more than a twopence. I need any amount of money for buses and trams if I went looking all over London. Anyway, I haven't the faintest idea where to look. I wonder if Uncle Andrew is still with her. It seemed in the end that the only thing he could do was to wait and hope that Uncle Andrew and the witch would come back, and if they did, he must rush out and get hold of the witch and put on his yellow ring before she had a chance to get into the house. This meant that he must watch the front door like a cat watching a mouse's hole. He dared not leave his post for a moment, so he went into the dining room and glued his face, as they say, to the window. It was a bow window from which you could see the steps up to the front door and see up and down the street, so that no one could reach the front door without your knowing. I wonder what Polly's doing, thought Diggory. He wondered about this a good deal as the first slow half hour trickled on. But you need not wonder, for I am going to tell you. She had got home very late for her dinner, or she had got home late for her dinner, with her shoes and stockings very wet. And when they asked her where she had been, and what on earth she had been doing, she said she had been out with Diggory Kirk. Under further questioning, she had said she got her feet wet in a pool of water, and that the pool was in a wood. Asked where the wood was, she said she didn't know. Asked if it was one of the parks, she said truthfully enough that she supposed it might be a sort of park. From all of this Polly's mother got the idea that Polly had gone off, without telling anyone, to some part of London she didn't know, and gone into a strange park and amused herself jumping into puddles. As a result, she was told that she had been very naughty indeed, and that she wouldn't be allowed to play with that Kirk boy any more if anything of the sort ever happened again. Then she was given dinner, with all the nice parts left out, and sent to bed for 2 solid hours. It was a thing that happened to one quite often in those days. So while Diggory was staring out of the dining room window, Polly was lying in bed, and both were thinking how terribly slowly the time could go. I think myself I would rather have been in Polly's situation. She had only to wait for the end of her 2 hours. But every few minutes Diggory could hear a cab, or a baker's van, or a butcher's boy coming around the corner and think, "Here she comes," and then find out it wasn't. And in between these false alarms, for what seemed like hours and hours, the clock ticked on, and one big fly, high up and far of reach, buzzed against the window. It was one of those houses that gets very quiet and dull in the afternoon, and always seems to smell of mutton. During his long watching and waiting, one small thing happened which I shall have to mention because something important came of it later. A lady called with some grapes for Dickory's mother, and as the dining room door opened, Dickory couldn't help overhearing Aunt Letty and the lady as they talked in the hall. "What lovely grapes!" came Aunt Letty's voice. "I'm sure if anything could do her good, these would. But poor, dear little Mabel, I'm afraid it would need a fruit from the land of youth to help her now. Nothing in this world will do much." Then they bowed, both lowered their voices, and said a lot more than he could not hear. If he had heard a bit about the land of youth a few days ago, he would have thought Aunt Letty was just talking without meaning anything in particular, the way grown-ups do, and it wouldn't have interested him. He almost thought now, but suddenly it flashed upon his mind that he now knew, even if Aunt Letty didn't, that there really were other worlds, and that he himself had been in one of them. At any rate, there might be a real land of youth somewhere. There might be almost anything. There might be fruit in some other world that would really cure his mother. And oh, oh, if you know how it feels, if you've been hoping for something that you want desperately badly, you'll almost fight against the hope because it is too good to be true. You've been disappointed so often before. That was how Dickory felt. But it was no good trying to throttle this hope. It might really, really, it just might be true. So many odd things had happened already, and he had the magic rings. There must be worlds you could get to through every pool in the wood. He would hunt through them all, and then mother well again, everything right again. He forgot about all the watching for the witch. His hand was already going into the pocket where he kept the yellow ring, when all at once he heard the sound of galloping. Hello? What's that? Thought Dickory. Fire engine? I wonder what house is on fire. Great Scott, it's coming here. Why, it's her. I needn't tell you who he meant by her. First came the hansom. There was no one in the driver's seat. On the roof, not sitting, but standing on the roof, swaying with superb balance as it came at full speed around the corner, with one wheel in the air, was Jadis, the queen of queens, and the terror of Charn. Her teeth were bared, her eyes shone like fire, and her long hair streamed out behind her like a comet's tail. She was flogging the horse without mercy. Its nostrils were wide and red, and its sides were spotted with foam. It galloped madly up to the front door, missing the lamp post by an inch, and then reared up on its hind legs. The hansom crashed into the lamp post and shattered into several pieces. The witch, with a magnificent jump, had sprung clear just in time and landed on the horse's back. She settled herself astride and leaned forward, whispering things in its ear. They must have been things meant not to quiet, but to madden it. It was on its hind legs again in a moment, and its neigh was like a scream, and all its hoofs and teeth and eyes and tossing mane. Only a splendid rider could have stayed on its back. Before Diggory had recovered his breath, a good many other things began to happen. A second hansom dashed up close behind the first. Out of it jumped a fat man in a frock coat and a policeman. Then came a third hansom, and two more policemen in it. After it came about 20 people, mostly errand boys, on bicycles, all ringing their bells and letting out cheers and catcalls. Last of all came a crowd of people on foot, all very hot with running, but obviously enjoying themselves. Windows shot up in all the houses of the street, and a housemaid or a butler appeared at the very front door. They wanted to see the fun. Meanwhile, an old gentleman had begun to struggle shakily out of the ruins of the first hansom. Several people rushed forward to help him, but as one pulled him one way and the other another, perhaps he would have gotten out quite quickly on his own. Diggory guessed that the old gentleman must be Uncle Andrew, but you couldn't see his face. His tall hat had been bashed down over it. Diggory rushed out and joined the crowd. "That's the woman! That's the woman!" cried the fat man, pointing at Jadis. "Do your duty, constable. Hundreds of thousands of pounds worth she's taken out of my shop. Look at that rope of pearls around her neck. That's mine. And she's giving me a black eye, too. What's more, that she's a governor," said one of the crowd, "and as lovely as black eyes I'd wish to see. Beautiful bit o' work that must 'a' been. Gor, ain't she strong then? You ought to put a nice raw beefsteak on it, mister. That's what it wants," said the butcher's boy. "Now then," said the most important of the policemen, "what's all this 'ere?" I, t- "I tell you she—" began the fat man, when someone else called out. "Don't let the old cove in the cab get away. 'E put her up to it." The old gentleman, who was certainly Uncle Andrew, had just succeeded in standing up and was rubbing his bruises. "Now then," said the policeman, turning to him, "what's all this?" "Womf, pomf, shumf," came Uncle Andrew's voice from inside the hat. "Now none of that," said the policeman sternly. "You'll find this is no laughing matter. Take that 'at off, see?" This was more easily said than done, but after Uncle Andrew had struggled in vain with the hat for some time, two other policemen seized it by the brim and forced it off. Thank you," said Uncle Andrew in a faint voice. "Thank you. Dear me, I'm terribly shaken. If someone could give me a small glass of brandy." "Now you attend to me, if you please," said the policeman. Taking out a very large notebook and a very small pencil. "Are you in charge of that there young woman?" "Look out!" called several voices, and the policeman jumped a step back just in time. The horse had aimed a kick at the man which would probably have killed him. Then the witch wheeled the horse round so fast that she faced the crowd, and its hind legs were on the footpath. She had a long, bright knife in her hand, and had been busily cutting the horse free from the wreck of the hansom. At this time Diggory had been trying to get into position in which he could touch the witch. This wasn't at all easy because, on the side nearest to him, there were too many people, and in order to get round the other side he had to pass between the horse's hoofs and the railings of the area which surrounded the house. For the Ketterleys' house had a basement. If you know anything about horses, and especially if you had seen what state the horse was in at the moment, you will realize that this was a ticklish thing to do. Diggory knew lots about horses, but he set his teeth and got ready to make a dash for it as soon as he saw a favorable moment. A red-faced man in a bowler hat and had now shouldered his way in front of the crowd. "Aye, policeman," he said. "That's my 'orse what she's sittin' on, and same as it's my cab that she's made matchwood of." "One at a time, please, one at a time," said the policeman. "But there ain't no time," said the cabby. "I know that 'orse better than you do. 'Tain't an ordinary 'orse. His father was an officer's charger in the cavalry, he was. And if the young woman goes on excitin' him, there'll be murder done. 'Ere, let me get at him." The policeman was only too glad to have a good reason to stand further away from the horse. The cabby took a step nearer, looked up at Jadis, and said in a not kindly voice, "Now, missy, let me get at his 'ead, and just you get off. You're a liddy, and don't want all these roughs goin' for you, do you? You want to go 'ome and 'ave a nice cup of tea and lay down quiet like. Then you'll feel ever so much better." At the same time he stretched out his hand toward the horse's head, with the words, "Steady, Strawberry, old boy, steady now." Then for the first time the witch spoke. "Dog," came her cold, clear voice, ringing loud above all the other noises. "Dog, unhand our royal charger. We are the Empress Jadis." And with that, I am going to stop for now. And I might be able to start up again tomorrow. So we're just gonna go ahead and raid into Sagril. Alright. See you guys later.